Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Okay, so today we're getting into something pretty heavy, but super important. Slavery reparations.
Definitely a big one.
Yeah, it's specifically, should Britain pay for its role in the transatlantic slave trade?
Right.
We found this article from The Week, and it really lays out all the sides of this issue, and wow.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
I mean, this whole discussion is not just about money, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about morality, historical responsibility. How do we deal with, the
That's
past?
huge, yeah.
It's a big one.
For sure. And one of the things that I think is when you start reading about this, you're kind of hit with that moral argument right away.
Absolutely.
And the article quotes this Nora Blake. She's a human rights activist in Jamaica. And she just says it point blank. Britain, you benefited. You got to own up to it and make amends.
Yeah, it's about recognizing the harm that was done and valuing the victims.
Yeah.
I mean, really, that's what it comes down to. It's not even so much about the actual dollar amount.
Right.
But it's more about saying, hey, we recognize this was wrong.
And we need to do something about it.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes you think, what does justice actually look like when you're talking about something as horrific as slavery?
Yeah, how do you even begin to unpack that?
Right.
I mean, and then you get into this whole other side of it, which is, okay, who gets paid? I mean, those directly enslaved, they're obviously not here.
Of course.
So it gets tricky.
But that's where you get into this whole concept of intergenerational justice, right?
Yeah.
Do the descendants then inherit this right to reparations?
Yeah, does that get passed down?
Exactly.
So, and this is interesting, the article mentions that Jamaica, the government, actually petitioned Britain for reparations.
They did recently.
Okay, so this is a recent thing.
Yeah.
And what they say.
Well, the British High Commission basically said, nope.
Really? Just flat out no.
Pretty much. Their reasoning was, well, the actual victims aren't alive anymore.
Okay, so beyond that point, I mean, what was the reasoning there?
They pointed to some precedents, said Britain has only ever paid reparations to living individuals.
Okay.
Cited things like the Windrush Compensation Scheme.
Okay.
They also suggested that maybe instead of reparations, focusing on education about slavery and maybe boosting development aid to these Caribbean nations would be more effective.
So more like tackling the problem in a different way.
Yeah, kind of shifting the focus.
Okay, interesting. One thing that really blew my mind when I was reading this article, just this fact, when slavery was abolished back in 1833, the British government, they paid a massive sum of money, but they paid it to the slave owners.
I know, right?
Not the people who were enslaved, but the owners.
It's crazy.
And we're talking somewhere between 16 pounds and 17 billion pounds in today's money.
It's a huge amount.
Massive. And the people who are enslaved, nothing.
It really highlights that economic imbalance, doesn't it?
For sure.
I mean, it fuels arguments like what Gahan Andrews, he's a British academic, he says Western wealth is basically built on the backs of, exploiting enslaved Africans in colonialism.
So it's built into the system.
Yeah, it's like this foundation. And he argues that for true racial equality to happen, there needs to be this massive transfer of wealth.
Wow, so you can't just ignore it like it didn't happen, right?
Right, it's not just some isolated event in the past. The impact is still felt today.
But how does that even work? A massive transfer of wealth?
Well, Andrews goes into the whole system, arguing that it's all built on this foundation of exploitation. And, for him to achieve true equality, we need to kind of look at those foundations again.
It's a pretty radical idea.
It is.
And the article makes sure to say, not everyone agrees with this.
Right, of course.
And they also point out that, some Caribbean nations are actually doing pretty well economically these days.
Yeah.
The Economist even says that, aid should be focused on the current needs.
Right, not necessarily fixing past wrongs.
So, where do you draw the line?
Yeah, that's the real tension here. Right?
Yeah.
How do you balance that? Taking responsibility for what happened, but also looking at the inequalities we see right now.
Right. And how do we address both?
Yeah.
So the article talks about this other idea, targeted aid.
Okay.
Instead of reparations.
Mm-hmm.
They quote this Rory Stewart, a former British politician, and he's like, look, UK aid should just be about helping the poorest people in the world, period. Not specifically focused on fixing, colonial wrongs.
Right, and that's the argument, isn't it?
Yeah.
That framing everything through this lens of reparations keeps people stuck in this victim narrative. And could that actually, hold back progress?
Is it almost like, keeping that wound open?
Yeah, it's this delicate balance for sure.
It is.
It is.
And there's this guy, Coleman Hughes, he testified at a U.S. congressional hearing on reparations, and he had this really interesting argument. He said constantly calling Black Americans victims is actually pretty condescending.
Really?
Yeah, and he said it ignores, their agency and resilience.
So it's almost like it's doing the opposite of what you'd want it to do.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
You have to think about these things, the unintended consequences.
Right.
How do you approach this in a way that empowers people instead of making them feel smaller?
Okay, so we've gone from this moral need to, who even gets paid. And now we're talking about targeted aid.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
A lot to think about.
The article also brings up this other approach, like, what if instead of money, what if it was a formal apology?
The power of, I'm sorry.
Yeah, but can an apology really address centuries of this, oppression and exploitation?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
But people who support this idea, they argue that a sincere apology from, an official source can carry a lot of weight. It acknowledges the harm, it shows remorse, and, maybe it's a starting point for reconciliation.
So it's like at least a step, right?
Right, exactly. It's a step in the right direction.
And I can see that being meaningful, especially if it's not just words.
Yeah.
If there's action behind it.
Right, you got to back it up.
Yeah, but has anyone actually done this? Like, apologize for slavery?
Some countries have.
Really?
Yeah. Back in 2008, the U.S. House of Representatives, they actually passed a resolution apologizing for slavery and Jim Crow laws.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah. So there is some precedent for this symbolic kind of reparation.
Interesting, but what about something more, tangible? What are some other ideas out there besides just saying sorry?
Well, one that's gaining some traction is this idea of investment, investing in education and economic programs.
Okay.
But specifically for the communities that were, most affected by slavery's legacy.
So you're trying to kind of create those opportunities, break those cycles of poverty.
Exactly. And those cycles often stem from, those historical injustices.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
And I can see how that, would benefit not just the individual, but, generations to come.
It's about trying to create a level playing field, right?
Yeah.
And another idea that's been floated is using public funds for scholarships and educational grants, but again, specifically for descendants of enslaved people.
So it's about getting that access to higher education.
Exactly, to open up those doors that might have been closed before.
So breaking down those systemic barriers.
Yeah, that's the goal.
I mean, and we've been talking about this. There's also this whole group of people who are just against reparations, period.
Right.
And they say, look, it's impossible to actually measure the impact.
Especially over such a long period of time.
Yeah, how do you even put a number on that?
Right. And they also argue that, focusing on the past prevents us from dealing with the problems we have right now.
So you're almost getting distracted from the current inequality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Things like poverty and discrimination that affect everyone, no matter their background.
So it's like, yeah, reparations are important, but so are these other things that are happening right now.
Right. It's about finding that balance.
It's like we're walking this tightrope.
We are.
Where you have to address the injustices of the past, but also be mindful of the consequences of your actions.
You don't want to create new problems while you're trying to solve old ones.
Yeah, exactly.
It's about finding solutions that make sense, that are practical, but also meaningful.
Solutions that are going to help build a better future for everyone.
Exactly. A just and equitable society.
So we've been deep diving into all of this, and I'm really curious to hear what you, the listener, think about all of this.
Yeah.
Like, what forms of redress do you think would actually work? Do you think direct reparations are the answer? Or maybe there are other approaches that we haven't even talked about.
Welcome.
We'd love to know your thoughts on this.
Absolutely. Because there isn't one right answer here.
Right.
This is a complex issue, and it needs, careful consideration.
It's not something you just come up with a solution for overnight.
Yeah. It's a conversation, a dialogue that needs to happen.
It's amazing, going through all of this whole idea of reparations. It's not new.
No, not at all.
It's been around for a while.
Yeah. I mean, it goes all the way back to the abolition movement.
Really?
Yeah. Even then, there were people saying that, freed slaves deserve some kind of compensation.
Wow. So this isn't some new idea. It's got deep roots.
Deep roots.
But it does feel like there's this renewed urgency to the conversation lately.
Yeah, definitely. I think, things like George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter movement, really put a spotlight on this whole idea of racial justice.
They force people to look at our history in a different way.
Yeah, confront some of these hard truths.
And it does feel like we're at this point where people are more willing to have these conversations.
Yeah, I think so. And it's not just about acknowledging the past, though, right? It's about understanding how that past is shaping our present.
Right, connecting the dots.
Exactly. Like, take the racial wealth gap, for example. That's a direct result of, slavery and all the discriminatory policies that came after.
It's all linked together.